Okay, we're at the start of the nervous system. In this short video, we're going to review general characteristics of the nervous system. So recall that from Chapter 1, way back in Chapter 1, we saw that there were two organ systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system, that do a lot of the same, have a lot of the same functions, overlapping functions with the body, and they complete, or they perform these overlapping functions in two different ways, right? So both of these systems respond to changes in our environment, what we called stimuli as a change in the environment. And these two organ systems then communicated those changes in the environment with other cells or tissues or organs. And they essentially also help regulate the actions of other cells, tissues, and organs. They do this regulation in a slightly different way with each one. Our main focus, of course, here is going to be nervous system, endocrine system. You'll see in A&P2 when you get to that point. That's chapter 16 in A&P2. All right. So we're going to look at how the nervous system communicates. So recall that the endocrine system uses chemical messengers called hormones. The nervous system also uses chemical messengers, but it also does something a little bit different in its communication. The nervous system uses a combination of both electrical and chemical signals, and it does so in a way that lets the nervous system communicate very rapidly with other cells, whereas the endocrine system was a much slower way of communicating with other cells and tissues. Particularly the electrical signal makes communication in the nervous system very rapid. So the electrical signals that are primarily used by the nervous system is a signal called the action potential, and this lets information travel down very long structures of the nervous system. So in this diagram here, what you're seeing emerging, so this is the spinal cord here running straight down the center of the back there. These structures that are emerging from it are called nerves, and these nerves are essentially just very long structures that are made out of the communication cells of our nervous system called the neurons. And these cells need a very rapid way to send information up and down them, and they do so by making use of these electrical signals called action potentials. Okay, but recall also that the nervous system does release chemical messengers, so that this electrical signal that's created within our nervous system cells results in the release of a chemical signal from one cell of the nervous system to communicate with the next cell in the line or in the chain there. And we call this chemical signal, we call it a neurotransmitter. So when it comes time for a cell of the nervous system to communicate with another cell, it does so by releasing a neurotransmitter, not by relaying its electrical signal between the two cells like a spark plug, if you think of it that way. All right. So let's look at a little bit more detail at the nervous system itself. The nervous system has two main subdivisions, and really one thing that I want you all to keep in mind as you're kind of thinking about the nervous system and these subdivisions of the nervous system is that the subdivisions are only anatomical in nature. That is, we consider two different anatomical parts of the nervous system, but both of these parts, these subdivisions, are functionally interconnected in that the two major subdivisions are what we call the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. This functional interconnectedness means that the central nervous system is not very good, it's not very effective at what it does if it doesn't have the peripheral nervous system to communicate with it. So anatomically we describe them separately, but functionally they're interconnected with one another. Okay? So the two main divisions, as I already mentioned, one of them is called the central nervous system. The central nervous system is only composed of two structures, all of the structures that are within the brain and all of the structures that are within the spinal cord are central nervous system structures. Okay. Recall that again, way back from chapter 1, recall that the brain and the spinal cord occupy their own cavities in the body. The brain occupies the cranial cavity, and the spinal cord occupies the vertebral cavity that's made by the vertebral column. And so both of these structures, the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity, make up the dorsal body cavity. Really anything that occupies these two cavities, the cranial or vertebral cavity, is considered a central nervous system structure. So any structure that belongs to the nervous system that is external to these cavities, it belongs to the peripheral nervous system. All right. Okay, so anything contained within these two body cavities is going to be a central nervous system structure. All right. So we've seen the central nervous system. All we have left to talk about is the peripheral nervous system, which is made out of these long structures that are called nerves that emerge from the brain or the spinal cord here, which you see in blue in this diagram here. We have a good diversity of nerves, a good number of nerves. Nerves emerge from both the brain and the spinal cord. The nerves that emerge from the brain are called the cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of those that emerge from the brain. We'll see. We'll take a look at their functions and their names later on when we get to chapter 12. The spinal cord has a few more nerves. We have 31 pairs of nerves that emerge from the spinal cord. So what do nerves do? What kind of things do they fulfill in the nervous system? What kind of tasks do they fulfill? And they actually do two things. Both the cranial and spinal nerves bring sensory information, that is, they convey sensory information like touch, pressure, temperature, sound, light information if it's coming from our eyes. This is sensory information that these nerves carry to the brain or to the spinal cord. And they always bring it, sensory information always has to come into the spine or into the central nervous system so that the central nervous system can decide how to respond to that particular sensory information or that particular piece of sensory information or that stimulus. Additionally, nerves also carry some of these same cranial and spinal nerves, but not all will send commands, what are called motor commands, to structures like muscles or glands. For this reason, information that's commands or motor commands that are leaving the brain or the spinal cord are referred to as motor commands. And if it's a muscle that happens to be at the end of this particular nerve, that muscle will contract. But if the structure is a gland, it can also be a gland. The gland could produce a substance or release a substance. All right. So let's look at the main functions overall of the nervous system, both central and peripheral nervous system functions. The nervous system, both central and peripheral nervous system, have three major functions that are highlighted in this diagram here. The first of which is called sensory input. The second is a function over here called integration. And the third and final function, sort of last but not least, is motor output, or what's called motor output. All right, so let's take a look at sensory input. What does sensory input entail? I already briefly discussed that a little bit, but we'll get into a little more detail here. All right, sensory input. What is sensory input? So the nervous system, particularly the peripheral nervous system, has structures called sensory receptors, and these are special structures of the nervous system or special cells associated with the nervous system that, again, as I mentioned, they're external to the brain and the spinal cord, so these are peripheral nervous system structures, and they respond to those external changes in the environment. They're responding to the stimuli. And when they detect these stimuli, what they do is they send the information, or they carry the information, to the central nervous system. It's carried by structures. Usually these structures are referred to as sensory nerves. Okay. Anytime you've got information coming into the central nervous system from the peripheral nervous system, we call that the afferent pathway. That is, information is being sent to our central nervous system. And afferent always implies approaching or information coming toward the central nervous system. All right, so let's talk a little bit about integration. Sensory input, I think, makes a little bit of sense. Integration may be a little more nebulous in terms of what its function actually is. So integration is basically the central nervous system deciding how it should respond to the stimulus that it has received. How should it respond to the sensory information that it has just received? And this is what integration really is. It's kind of the decision-making process of the central nervous system. Integration uses a couple of different things. Not only does it use the sensory input that's being brought in at any given time point from sensory nerves, but it also uses past experience. So that is, it it remembers, or we remember important things that have happened in our past, important pieces of sensory information, I should say, from our past. An example of this is when we wake up in the morning and it's cold outside, right? Our response is to put a jacket on. So we recall from past experience that if it's cold outside, right, that's going to chill our bodies. So we're gonna take appropriate actions to try to help us stay warm throughout the day at that point. Okay, so that's integration, is the decision-making part of or function of the nervous system, and that always occurs in the central nervous system, either the brain or the spinal cord. All right, and function number 3 that we'll take a look at is what's called motor output. And motor output is simply the response to the stimulus. How does our central nervous system respond to the particular stimulus or the sensory information that we've received? And it's going to do so by issuing what's called a motor command. And motor commands always leave the central nervous system. That is, they're always exiting the central nervous system to structures like muscles or glands that are in different parts of the body. Right? These leave through structures that are called motor nerves. So even if this nerve makes a synapse with a gland, it's still called a motor nerve. But typically motor nerves also make synapses with muscles, skeletal muscles, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle. And because information, or what we refer to information leaving the central nervous system, motor commands are or travel along what's called the efferent pathway, where again efferent implies that information commands are leaving the central nervous system to an external structure. All right, so we've reviewed functions of the nervous system. We'll very briefly take a look at cells of the nervous system here. Like muscular tissues, so recall that we had tissues that had a lot of cells associated with them, and we had tissues that have a lot of extracellular materials or extracellular matrix associated with them. We saw that the epithelial tissues and the muscular tissues are very cellular tissues, whereas the connective tissues had a lot of extracellular material outside of those cells that make up those tissues. The nervous system is very similar to epithelial and muscular tissues, and then it's a highly cellular tissue. That is, most of the material that makes up the nervous system is going to be cells. We have two categories of cells, two main types of cells that differ in their function. We have the neurons, which are the signal-sending cells, we'll see in a minute. And we also have a cell type, or a group of cells that are collectively known as the neuroglia, or what are called glial cells. And these, they don't send signals in the nervous system, but rather they fulfill what we call supporting roles, or they have other roles in the nervous system. So we'll take a look briefly at neurons and neuroglia. The neurons, as I mentioned, these are the signal-sending cells, and these are what we call excitable cells. So recall that excitable means that the cell can change, or the cell will undergo a change in its membrane voltage when a stimulus is applied to it. All right, so these are excitable cells. As I mentioned, they send signals, and they respond to stimuli. So these are really the signaling cells of the nervous system. So our main focus will be on neuron physiology in this chapter. All right. And we also have this group of cells called the neuroglia. And the neuroglia, as I mentioned, these are not excitable cells. That is, they don't change their membrane voltage in response to a stimulus. But they serve other supporting roles in the nervous system, because our neurons are very highly specialized to send signals, so they're really not good at much else other than being able to send signals long distances throughout the body. The neuroglia kind of take the supporting role of the nervous system, whereas they can serve functions and serve purposes outside of signal sending.